Hi, I'm Stephen Bruce. I run the Academy of Physical Medicine, and here's 45 minutes of free CPD for you. This is just an example of what we do. We run a free session every month, along with 70 plus hours of live learning with others CPD every year. If you'd like to see more, click the link in the info section below the video, and that'll take you through to our website. Enjoy. Well, good afternoon again. Lovely to see so many people joining us for these lunchtime broadcasts, and thank you for being one of them. Turning to today, however, I've got Bob with us waiting to join me via the video link, and we are going to be talking about gender issues, gender dysphoria, affirming gender identity, trauma-informed treatment. Now, I recognise that gender issues can be pretty divisive, and I've already had a few emails stating people's opinions one way or the other. But it's not something we can ignore in the modern world, and of course we've got an obligation to treat impartially and so on. And to such an extent that the GCC has made it the focus of CPD this year for chiropractors to look at diversity and inclusion. So if you're a chiropractor, this is a particularly relevant piece of CPD for you. Bob, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us here. I mean, this is something which you're a psychoanalyst yourself, aren't you? And this is something which you've been involved in for some years. Do you want to give us a bit more background about yourself and rather set the scene for the discussion?
Yes, well, I've been asked here as a member of an organisation called the Clinical Advisory Network on Sex and Gender, which includes a variety of people from a number of backgrounds: psychiatrists, GPs, psychotherapists and psychoanalysts like myself, largely. But the reason that I was volunteered to be the one to appear today is because I also have a background in complementary medicine. So before I trained to be an analyst, I actually practiced as an acupuncturist and as a homeopath.
Right.
And I did some academic research into homeopathy at the University of Sussex. And then I went on to teach for 14 years at the University of Westminster, where I was a senior lecturer in their Department of Complementary Therapy Studies. And I was particularly interested in and devised modules for their master's program on the mind-body relationship, particularly in complementary medicine, and also on working with the therapeutic relationship in a psychotherapeutically informed way. So you can see that I think that today's subject is kind of up my street, really, because as you'll hear later, I believe that we can help conceptualize some kind of rudimentary understanding of gender dysphoria through a consideration of the mind-body relationship. And I'll very briefly say how I got into this area of work with transgender people. And it was like this. Initially, my first transgender client I saw in the early 1990s. And he was actually a detransitioning male to female, back to male, transsexual person, as we used to call them in those days. And he'd lived as a woman, having fully medically transitioned for 9 years. And he'd found that it hadn't resolved his psychological problems. So he came to see me, and I worked with him analytically for 4 years, seeing him 3 times a week, and gained a considerable understanding of where his trans identification had come from, really. And he wished that he had had proper psychotherapy before he'd done something permanent to his body. So that's my first introduction to transgender issues, was somebody who had permanently harmed his body. Obviously, he'd been castrated and he was taking estrogen, and he couldn't get his body back. And it alerted me quite early on to the importance of trying to work psychologically or non-invasively, if we can, before reverting to more radical treatments, including surgery and hormones. So that's my kind of background. I've sometimes been accused of being transphobic because I don't just affirm people in their trans identity and just automatically support their medical transition. Because part of my work as a researcher has been also to look at the science which underlies some of the research papers. And although this isn't the place for me to talk about that today, I have been astounded by the incredibly poor quality of the evidence which has been put forward in support of the so-called gender-affirming treatment. Unfortunately, it's more driven by ideology than by scientific evidence.
Sorry, if I may interrupt you,
Sure.
I feel that the argument is polarized, very polarized, and I imagine that there are those who are just as vigorously opposed to anybody transitioning as there are those who are vigorously in favor of people being allowed to or encouraged to make that transition. And one of the areas where I'm trying to do here is to enable us to have an understanding of how you decide what's appropriate for people, how you can help people in that situation.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's really good and important, and it is incredibly polarized. You're so right. There are people on both sides. There are some people who think it never should happen. Nobody should ever medically transition, and there are some people who think it's an infringement of trans people's rights if they don't get immediate access to all the surgical and hormonal treatments that they demand. Those two camps can roughly fall into the trans-affirmative camp and what's sometimes called the gender-critical camp. And what I'm very glad about is that you've asked somebody, not just from the trans-affirmative side, to speak today. And it's very important that we consider all of these issues, as you're hoping to do, in a kind of a balanced way.
I think I did mention to you, didn't I, that I've had a couple of discussions with a chap called Simon Croft, a trans man from Gendered Intelligence, the organisation in London, and yeah. He spoke very, very well, but his was largely making an assumption that transitioning was what was required on the basis of the people that he'd come across. And I think it's really important to hear the other side of this story as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, so as I say, I'm not against transitioning, and I don't deny that people feel better often if they have transitioned. But as somebody who's researched homeopathy in the past, which also had powerful effects on people, I would like to make a plea for the power of the mind. And one of the research areas that I have tackled at the University of Westminster is the placebo effect. And although people may say that they feel better from homeopathy, it doesn't, when you do a scientific study, actually outperform placebo. And it's entirely possible that the same could turn out to be true for the medical treatment of gender dysphoria, because the evidence so far collected has not been scientifically rigorous, as I said. But before going into a bit more detail about this, I just thought I could step for a moment into some slightly less controversial territory around trying to illustrate what the power of the mind can be in my experience. And if you bear with me for a couple of minutes, what I think I'd like to do, just to set the scene, because there are some people who don't really think that the mind has much effect on the body, and who perhaps, I know from working with osteopaths in the past and acupuncturists and doctors as well, that there are some people who take quite a materialistic view of the human condition, and they think that the only really effective treatment is going to be physical treatment, and they think that the only real suffering is physical suffering. And there are other people, more from the psychotherapeutic side perhaps, who feel more or less the opposite, which is they think about the power of the mind, trumping the power of the body. And one of the areas that we researched at Westminster was this is a book called Understanding the Placebo Effect in Complementary Medicine, edited by David Peters, colleague of mine, who's professor. I think he may be retired now. He's an osteopath. And the following extract is from my chapter in that book, and it's called Psychoanalysis, Complementary Medicine, and the Placebo. So bear with me for a moment. It starts off, Mr. X and the nocebo. So the nocebo is the opposite of the placebo. I'll start with a case from my work as an acupuncturist, taken from my chapter, Complementary Medicine, Psychoanalysis, and the Placebo, in that book. Some 15 years ago, and actually I was writing this in about 2000, so maybe the case was in 1985, before I trained to be a therapist. Some 15 years ago, I was a recently qualified acupuncturist. A man walked into my consulting room suffering from acute rheumatoid arthritis. He was a small man in his late 20s with a pronounced fear of needles. And his symptoms were severe enough to keep him off work. He tried conventional treatment without any lasting success. And he turned to acupuncture in desperation. But he was too frightened because of his fear of needles in the first session to allow me to insert any needles. And instead, we talked about the origins of his fear, in the hope that if we could understand it, he might be able to overcome it enough to let me treat him in the next session. Mr. X, as I shall call him, was one of those people who have an intuitive grasp of their own psychology without ever having been in therapy, and with very little prompting from me, he went on to describe his relationship as a boy with his much-loved grandmother. She was a large and friendly woman, and he was in the habit of a morning of climbing into her bed and romping about before she got up. And he recalled with obvious emotion a particular incident as a 6-year-old. On the morning in question, he climbed into her bed as usual, but noticing that she was very still, he began tugging at her to wake her up. Eventually, he succeeded in rolling her over. But to his horror, she fell out of bed, pinning him to the floor underneath her. Trapped and panicking, his cries eventually alerted the other adults, who came and removed her dead body from on top of him. She died in the night, and he dated his fear of being trapped and helpless, and hence his fear of acupuncture, to this incident. Following this account, Mr. X gradually became able to tolerate my needles, and I began treating him according to the principles of TCM, traditional Chinese medicine. He responded well, and within a few treatments, he was able to return to work and gradually reduce the frequency of his sessions. Things progressed in a satisfactory, if unspectacular manner, until one day when he missed an appointment. It so happened at this time that I was having trouble with people cancelling appointments in what I considered a casual manner. And having recently started psychotherapy myself, where missed sessions are charged for, I decided to tackle him about it when he turned up for his next session. In order to do this, I chose the time when he was lying on the couch with the needles in, as this is a fallow time not taken up with what I considered the more important business of information gathering and diagnosis. He told me that on the day in question, he'd set out as usual for his appointment, only to find that British Rail had changed their timetable. He said he understood that I'd lost my income for that session, but he didn't feel inclined to pay the fee himself since the change in timetable wasn't his fault. I commented that it wasn't my fault either, and in the end we settled on a compromise where he paid half the fee, and apparently satisfied, he walked out. I was horrified when he hobbled in, racked with pain for his next session. The redness and swelling had returned to his joints, and he was off work again, in as bad a state as when I'd first seen him. My first thought was to check my treatment notes, but there was nothing unusual about the points I'd used. Next, I asked whether he'd done anything different himself since we'd last met, but he said he hadn't. Puzzled and disappointed, I could see no option but to continue with the treatment as usual, which I did. When the session ended, he thanked me for my help and said that he didn't want to spend any more money on a treatment that had stopped working. And it was my lunchtime at this point, and as he turned to me one last time, he asked whether I thought the mind could have an effect on the body. And I said I was sure it could, but I asked him what he meant. In time, now outside the official session, he proceeded to tell me with great vehemence how I made him feel in the previous session. I'd known about his fear of being trapped, so he found it incredible that I'd chosen his time on the couch to confront him about the money. He'd felt pinned down by me and my needles, unable to express his anger about being charged anything for a session that he'd missed through no fault of his own. And he attributed the return of his symptoms directly to this experience, and went on in this vein until exactly half a session's worth of time had passed. He turned and left, leaving me feeling crushed. So that was just something to illustrate how the dynamics of the therapeutic relationship and how the mind can affect the body in quite powerful ways.
So again, of course, we want to put this into the context of physical therapy, where people are coming to, my audience today, which is predominantly osteopaths and chiropractors. Someone comes in, and I imagine it is possible that their concerns about their own gender identity might come up in the case history taking during a discussion during treatment. And I suppose what we need to get out of this is to be able to offer evidence-based advice, rational, reasonable advice to anyone in that position, without sort of driving them down any particular route.
Well, absolutely. So one needs to remain neutral, and people often don't want to talk about their gender problems or their psychological problems. I mean, I don't want to spend all the time on this case, but I did get. Sometimes you hear from a patient after you've seen them, and I heard from this guy, and he said, "Hi Bob, I was surfing the net to see if you were still in practice in Brighton. It appears that you're not, but your name did come up, and I found the above article in which I feature as Mr. X. I remember you asking me about the use of the story, which is fine. It seemed very strange to read about an incident in which I feature. I never thought I'd ever get to read it, so stardom for me." And he goes on to say, "I just thought you'd be interested to know that in the quite recent past, the wheels have come off my wagon in health terms. I've become somewhat disabled with RA, and the side effects of the conventional treatment have caused more problems than the actual disorder. I had a considerable period off work," and he talks about how he was seeing a TCM practitioner, a professor from Chinese medicine, in a shopping mall in Eastbourne, but because of language problems, he didn't really have the chance to talk to her about some of the emotional issues that he said he hated talking to me about, but realized with the benefit of hindsight had actually been very important. So I think that when you're raising the question you just raised, Stephen, about how do we work with the psychological side of people who present maybe with a straightforward problem, bad back or poor pain in their limbs or, jaw or whatever it is, but they also have gender issues, and maybe these are related, maybe their physical symptoms might relate. You sometimes find that people who have been sexually abused, for instance, have medically inexplicable abdominal pains, which are kind of body memories of traumas which have been suffered and stored in the body. And some of these people will defensively, in my opinion, identify as trans as a way of trying to escape the vulnerability in the body. So I've seen since then a couple of other detransitioners, one of them a woman who was sexually exploited by people who were very close to her, and she considered something about her own dependency needs and her femininity had made her vulnerable to that exploitation, and after it she identified as trans. That was, she thought of herself as male, had the surgery and hormones, and then ended up regretting it and is now a detransitioner. And the other thing and of course, if she'd been able to talk to the practitioner beforehand about the trauma that she'd suffered, there's a strong chance that that would have helped relieve some of the discomfort that she felt with her female body, and she might not have actually gone through with the surgery and hormones. So although I'm not trying to say, never have surgery, never have hormones, because some people, that may be the best way that they can manage their pain. What I am pleading is that if it is possible to resolve the gender dysphoria psychologically or through a physical treatment like osteopathy without having that invasive medical treatment, then that's better than becoming a long-term medical patient of treatments with very poor treatment record, very poor evidence of effectiveness, and long-term side effects, some of which are really quite difficult. Another common theme that can happen, unfortunately, is sometimes if people are brought up in rather a homophobic environment, they can feel very uneasy with their own body's sexual response, their physical bodily response, and they can interpret that as being born in the wrong body or as gender dysphoria. And so one of the other detransitioners I've worked with, that was the case. He realized that he was just a gay man brought up in a very macho homophobic environment, and like my first patient, he very much regrets what's happened to him and is quite despairing. So although one must accommodate diversity, and that includes inclusion of people who are trans-identified, I think there are other groups as well who need consideration. and that includes the detransitioners. We can learn a lot from the people who regret their transition about what went wrong and how we might have been able to prevent that, so that before they do something drastic and immediate, they have a chance to explore other options. I'd also like to make a distinction, which I think is important, between gender identity, being trans, and gender dysphoria, because gender dysphoria is a discomfort that can arise for some people who are trans, but it doesn't arise for everybody. If you read the book, for instance, the book Time to Think, if anybody's really serious about finding out what went wrong at the Tavistock Gender Identity Development Service, Hannah Barnes's book, Time to Think, is really excellent. And in there, she's got a case of somebody who is identified in terms of their gender identity as male, but they're biologically female. But they don't want any medical treatment for it because they're able to live with that diversity within their own human makeup. So not everybody wants psychotherapy or medical treatment.
Bob, do you have any idea of the proportion of trans people who regret their transition? I suppose the only measure of that is those who have detransitioned, but maybe you've got a feel for how prevalent the problem is?
Well, unfortunately, the people that I've come across who this has happened to have been so vilified and trolled and regarded as traitors by the people who are advocating easier access to surgery and hormones that they don't, I mean, they have to be very brave to come out as detransitioners. And none of the people I've seen have gone back to the clinics where they've been transitioned in the first place. And they don't, the data has not been properly collected. And the studies, again, if you do, because I'm a former academic, I'm retired now from University of Westminster, but if you look at the studies, there are studies which claim that it's a very, very low regret rate. And what they don't mention is that 35% of people in the biggest study by somebody called Weepiers dropped out of it. They don't count people who are dead at the time of the study. So if somebody's so upset by what has happened that they commit suicide, that's not counted as transition regret. They're just not part of the figures. Anybody who did, so the studies again are very poor. I mean, I will just say, at the risk of getting a little bit too technical, the Weepier study, which is the largest one, only accepts people as valid detransitioners if they go back to the clinic where they transitioned originally, have had full gonadal surgery, gonadectomies, and request the hormones to go back to their original sex. So it's a pretty high bar for somebody to actually say, I regret it and I want to go back. And they find between about 0.5 and 1%. But other studies which have a wider definition of regret, they're very few. This is an area that's not been properly researched because anybody trying to research it gets accused of transphobia. But there was a recent study in Cambridge which showed about 7% of people actually regretting it in their study. And about another 7% who were not sure, who looked as if they might end up regretting it. And the other thing that the studies have shown is that the regret, when it occurs, tends to happen about 10 years after the initial transition. And this new wave of people, it's increased from about 50 people at the Children's Gender Identity Clinic in 2009 to about 2,700 in 2019. This huge increase has happened within the last 10 years. So we don't know, is the honest answer, how many of these people are going to regret it. But the danger is that if there are psychological elements which are encouraging people to identify as trans in order to get away from trauma stored in their body or being bullied at school for being gay, then we're not going to find out the true figures of regret until much later. So we don't know yet, but that Cambridge study was a fairly small number. And the area needs researching. A man called James Caspian, a colleague of mine, had a place to research detransitioning, and his university first of all gave him permission to go ahead, and then because of the fear of the accusations of transphobia, he had to abandon his research. So it's a complicated area where, I mean, I as you said before the introduction, Stephen, I have been accused of transphobia or being anti-trans because I do advocate working in non-invasive ways if it's possible to resolve the gender dysphoria, without radical surgery and hormones. I do think that's preferable. Yeah, I forgot what I was going to say there, actually. But
well, if I can, I've got a couple of observations that have come in from the audience.
Yeah.
Matthew says, as a practitioner, it can be hard sometimes to negotiate the division between affirmation and accusations of transphobia. It often seems to be too strongly driven by the personal agendas of the people involved. And I think you'll sympathise with that, Bob. You can do a lot to mostly get it right, but you're guaranteed to get it wrong sometimes. And I hope this can be accepted as okay in practice. Now, I don't know what situations Matthew's got in mind there in terms of getting it wrong, but I know what he means. For many of us, it would come as a surprise when a patient perhaps admits to, acknowledges that they are in some way transitioning, and we then start to worry about what language we use and what we can ask them to do, and whether we have to consider binders and all the other things that might affect their health, and therefore we might say the wrong thing.
Thank you. That is such an important question. So when working with these clients, it's very important not to be put in the transphobic camp, and it's so easy to be put there, and then the patient clams up and doesn't feel that they want to talk to us. So in terms of managing the therapeutic relationship, trying to be neutral and trying to be accepting, and trying not to condemn what the patient wants to do, even though we may be inwardly quite frightened for their safety, that's really important in terms of preserving the therapeutic relationship as a safe place where the person feels they can trust the therapist. And if as a result of some osteopathic treatment, somebody, flashes back to sexual abuse and starts to get upset, I think it's important that the therapist doesn't close that up, but feels able to create a safe place for the person to talk about their mental and emotional well-being as well as working physically. And if you get out of your depth with somebody like that, I would advise you should maybe try and get some supervision from somebody with some psychological knowledge or skill. And I remember what I was going to say earlier, which slipped my mind, which is that I actually think it's transphobic to encourage people to have a medical treatment with evidence which has been called either poor or very poor by neutral agencies such as the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. I think that's a kind of transphobia because we wouldn't advocate poorly evidenced treatment for any other disadvantaged group of people. So why aren't these people entitled to the same quality of evidence for treatment as everybody else? And it seems to me that there's been so much political disturbance and the culture wars that we've all been part of. Feelings have got so high and people have become so frightened to speak about, what they believe, what they think, what they can see, what they can hear, that somehow the people who have got damaged by this and swept up in it, unfortunately, I think we're going to find in the long term, are the vulnerable children with other mental health problems. Autism is very high. Trauma stored in the body is quite common. I think we're in danger of finding that in the rush to affirm and support people, we've let these people down. And I am in favour of trans rights, but I'm also in favour of the rights of autistic kids, of gay people not to be encouraged to transition, of women to have safe space and safe competition in sports where they're not being outcompeted by biological males. So I think it's a question of balancing different rights. And although that's not really my concern, I'm not concerned so much with the social stuff and the political stuff. I am concerned with trying to work in a sensitive and effective way that honours the biopsychosocial holistic approach. So not just the chemical or physical one, not just the psychological one either. But these are people who if they're suffering with gender dysphoria, they're suffering in a holistic biopsychosocial way, and I think they deserve proper biopsychosocial support and treatment.
Yes, and I imagine that many of the people watching today will be thinking, well, this is outside our remit. The problem is that ours is a fairly intimate treatment environment, whether you're a chiropractor or an osteopath. Very often our patients are undressed to some degree. It's very hands-on in most cases. And I suspect that maybe we might be an early opportunity for someone to disclose those psychological concerns that they have. And Ken has said, when dealing with a psychological patient, you can't take the high ground of, I know it will be better for you in the long term. If in the short term they mess up your mind, stress you out, and potentially damage your career with a complaint, signpost them to the GP is Ken's solution. There are enough simple cases to deal with. Yeah, I can see, and I absolutely understand what he's saying there. We do need to signpost people to the services which can deal with them more effectively than we as non-psychotherapeutic professionals can.
Excuse me, yes, I agree. And I think when I was making my transition from being a complementary therapist to being, choking on my water, to being a psychotherapist, it was very useful for me to have a friendly psychotherapist or two that I could refer to with confidence. But I think you're absolutely right that sometimes it's in the complementary therapy consulting room that people first talk about their emotional issues, maybe being trans, perhaps being traumatized.
Yes.
And sometimes our reaction as complementary therapists is to think, no, this isn't my concern. I've got to refer the person away. And although that might be true, and although one should be able to recognize the limits of one's competence, I think if a complementary therapist is working holistically, it is important to have some psychological and emotional empathy and understanding. And I think often it is possible to create a space where people can talk about emotional issues, relationship issues, feeling uneasy with their body. Very often there's a condition here where it's known as mind-body dissociation, where the person identifies with a disembodied mind and feels that the body is alien. And that often happens when somebody's been physically or emotionally traumatized. And then they can experience the body as somewhere where they don't feel at home in. And the dissociation can be anything mild, like a sense of tingling or numbness, to some complete sense of this isn't my body, this is completely unreal. And if the person is identified with a disembodied mind, which is gendered oppositely to the body, then the whole notion of attempting to settle back into the body becomes very frightening, because that person might encounter a trauma or a feeling which is at odds with, diametrically at odds with, the psychological identification that they've got. And actually one of the simplest ways of getting a person to get re-embodied is through touch. So if you're touching the back of somebody who is feeling that their genitals aren't working, aren't functioning sexually, they're numb, and in the course of the treatment, they find themselves back in touch with their feelings in their genitals, that can be very alarming for that person, and it can bring back memories of the sexual trauma that caused them to dissociate in the first place. Now, I'm not suggesting that osteopaths should work in depth with people who've been sexually traumatized, but if that happens in your consulting room and you just shut up shop and say, this is too far for me, I can't handle this, you're giving that person a message that they've got to go back to the dissociation. They've just had an experience where they've opened up maybe for the first time to somebody who they're hoping can be receptive and sympathetic and understanding. And I think we let people down if we let them go too quickly, and if we refer them on too quickly to specialists. And the other question is, which specialists do we refer them on to? Because the gender world in therapy is divided into these two camps. You've got the gender affirming camp who say, okay, well, I'll affirm you in your trans identity and I'll support you getting surgery and hormones because that's a gender affirming treatment. And you've got other people in the gender critical camp who will say, no, before we do that, it's really important to work psychologically because you might make a mistake. So who do you refer to? And are you referring to somebody who's gender affirmative or somebody who's gender exploratory? And do you know the difference? And does the patient know the difference? So it's even that referral is a huge responsibility. And in the past, people have referred to the specialist clinics like the Gender Identity Development Service at the Tavistock GIDS. And as I said earlier, the Hannah Barnes book exposes just what went wrong there, because that whole organisation became enthralled to activist organisations like Mermaids, who were very radically in favour of transitioning and advocated easier access to surgery and hormones. So
Lars, one of our viewers, has said that he feels at the moment that we haven't really dealt with how we handle transgender issues in our own clinics. I think that's I think it's a very difficult question to answer, because there are so many aspects to the problem, or if it's a problem. What would you say?
Well, I would say that each person is individual, and in a clinic, what we need to do is be welcoming to everybody. We need to accept everybody. Some people come into a clinic absolutely convinced they're trans, absolutely convinced that they need surgery and hormones, and they might be coming for an osteopathic treatment because they've got some pain in their back or some numbness in some part of their body. And we don't need to take them on and challenge them in that belief. We just give them the support and the treatment that they've come to us for, and it would be a mistake to antagonize them. But other people come genuinely curious, wanting to think about whether there are other ways of managing their discomfort with their body. And they might well be open to a certain amount of exploration with the osteopath.
Perhaps one of the issues that we need to think about is, well, how would we discover that this is part of the problem? I mean, you're certainly preaching to the converted when you talk about the power of the mind and the biopsychosocial model, but it wouldn't be a standard question in anyone's case history. Are you worried about your gender? Do you feel you ought to be what you're not at the moment?
No, although some people do recommend having it, don't they, as a part of your questionnaire, what gender are you? I'm not sure that's... You see, I think, just speaking as a psychotherapist now, which is, what I've been doing after all for the last 35 years, very often people with gender issues are actually struggling with ordinary psychotherapeutic problems. They're depressed, they don't get on with their parents, their sex lives aren't functioning very well. As I say, they may have been traumatized, they may be being bullied at school, they may be suffering from anxiety, and a lot of them may be autistic. And so we wouldn't necessarily have to focus on the gender issue. It wouldn't necessarily have to be a specialist area. It could just be part of a holistic treatment, where the person may talk about their gender if they wanted to, and they may not if they don't want to. As I said earlier, some people are quite happy to have a gender that's opposite to their body. Some people might feel really distressed by that. So then you could actually, if they were distressed, you could explore the nature of the distress. When did it happen? What makes it worse? What does it feel like? What actually distresses you? The typical one is people who hate their male body. They don't like the hair. They don't like getting erections. And if you ask them, what's your experience of masculinity? Well, it's something that I find quite often is they've had very negative experiences of masculinity, toxic masculinity. Maybe they've had a father who's sexually abused them, or, one of my patients' father used to get drunk, throw knives at mother, and then ran away to the circus when he was 4, So if you get a very bad image of masculinity through your childhood experience, then you can end up feeling very ill at ease with your own male body. And so I would work with that and trust that there's a good chance that if the work is effective, and I'm talking about work as a psychotherapist here, that might result in somebody seeking a solution to their gender dysphoria that doesn't involve becoming a lifelong medical patient who's sterile and, let's call a spade, castrated,
Yeah, there's a couple of observations I've seen in the notes here about that have come in, looking at two different sides of the psychological aspect. One person, identified by the system as Quest, says that they're not transphobic, but his or her children at secondary school see their friends thinking that trans is a fashion. I don't know if that's something which you feel is an influencing factor. Julie, on the other hand, says, I had a female patient many years ago who fully transitioned to male. I just let him guide me through conversations over time. Transition took a couple of years and was completed with no drama or problem. And Julie's point is there seems to be rather a lot of hysteria about the problem at the moment, perhaps driven by the polarity of the argument.
Yeah, and also the radical nature of the treatment, perhaps.
Yeah.
There is a lot of hysteria, and it's unfortunate. The whole area needs cooling down, and we need a rational look at it. We need proper discussions like this, where you can ask people from both sides of the so-called trans debate or the trans wars or whatever you want to call it, to actually, express views and discuss it and answer questions from people like the last questioner who are, just concerned to be decent, good practitioners, giving the best service they can for their patients, whatever those patients are, however they identify, and whatever treatment courses they want to go down. But there is some evidence that there's a kind of a degree of social contagion going on here, because not only have the referral numbers gone up astronomically, but also the demographic has changed. So it's much more likely now to be females to males than males to females. In the olden days, it was about 3-to-1 boys who didn't want to be boys, and now it's about 3-to-1 girls who don't want to be girls. So there's something going on socially which we need to understand more about. It's a huge area. You can get lost in it. I could spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week researching and looking at all of this, but I have to resist the temptation, and I suspect we all have to go back to our work fairly soon and put a limit to it. I don't know what you think.
Matthew's come in with, I'm going to race through these last couple of comments. Matthew says patients sometimes are unwilling to accept advice and explanations which appear to contradict their own self-image and preconceptions. He had this recently when he tried to explain to an existing patient that his history of rugby playing might affect the results he could expect from treatment. And he wanted to leave the session before it started, saying I was being negative. And Matthew says you can see that applying to this subject area of trans issues as well.
Yeah, it does. It applies to all sorts of areas. Freud called it resistance. He said that there's a part of us that wants to get well, but there's also a part of us that kind of gets invested in our illness and doesn't want to give it up, and then we meet resistance. So that's a lot of what, being a good therapist of any sort is partly about how to work with that resistance, how to help the person sort of feel that you're on their side, while at the same time being incisive and confronting them if necessary.
Yeah. And that probably supports what Kerry has said, that she says, coming at this from never having been in the position, would it be acceptable just to be honest and say something along the lines of, I don't have much experience with what you're going through, I'm happy to listen and support you from an osteopathic perspective, she's an osteopath, and potentially guide you, presumably, the question's unfinished here, but guide you to further support other resources where possible?
Yeah, I think that's a very honest way, isn't it? And at the same time, you'll probably find once you do start working with these people that you will get interested in trying to understand it, like I did. So trying to work with my first detransitioner led me to do loads and loads of research and write papers. Actually, my latest paper, if I'm allowed to plug it just before we finish,
of course.
Is in this book. It's called Jung's Shadow Concept, and my paper is called Gender Dysphoria, Individuation and the Shadow. And there I try and set out a little bit of a sort of psychological formulation for how we might understand this mind-body dissociation, and I try to answer some basic questions, frequently answered questions about, frequently asked questions about how might we work with gender dysphoric people, either as a therapist or as a teacher or as a parent. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, there's one area of my own personal experience which challenges me to some degree, because I know of a young person who has transitioned to male, and a very young person. That young person is probably now 17 or thereabouts. And it's not a patient at all, but it seems to be a very well-adjusted, very happy young person. the parents are both very intelligent, very engaged parents, and I don't sense that there's any dysfunction in the family, and yet I still feel to myself, my word, isn't that an early age to make a decision like this? Now, I don't know any of the details. I don't know whether the Tavistock Clinic were involved. I don't know whether any surgical intervention or hormonal intervention has been undertaken at this stage, but of course I just don't know enough about it to offer any suggestions or advice. Not that I'm being asked to, because this isn't one of my patients.
No, well, it is very young, isn't it? And of course, the brain doesn't mature fully till we're in our mid-20s. And part of beginning to feel more at home in our bodies is through sexual pleasure and sexual experimentation. So if we find something that makes us feel good and also connects us with someone that we love, then very often the feelings of the body being an alien place, they disappear on their own. So what's been found in a variety of studies is that gender dysphoria, which starts in childhood, by the end of adolescence, once people have passed through puberty, about 80% of cases resolve spontaneously. So I always say to my patients, look, before you do anything drastic, just for goodness sake, get out there and see what feels nice in your body with somebody that cares about you, that you care about. And so many people spend so much time behind screens just talking to people like we are now, using virtual reality.
Indeed, as we are now. Bob, I'm going to have to cut you off because we're right up against the clock. We have, as I said, we've had 400 people watching the show, so it's clearly a topic of interest to a large number of people, and it's a topic that's not going to go away anytime soon. So thank you for your expert intervention there. We'll send people the links to the publications that you mentioned so that they can have the option to dig those up if they like. But we are, I'm afraid, out of time for today. Thank you for joining us. I hope the discussions proved as useful as I hoped it would, and as thought-provoking as I expected it would for you. From my own perspective, I think it's, as I've said, I think it's vital we've got a balanced view on what is a fairly divisive topic, and most importantly, that we can treat all our patients fairly and equally. And if you want to see our previous shows on this, where I talked to Simon Croft from Gender Intelligence, those will be posted on the website very shortly. As you know, we are currently getting up all the previous recordings as quickly as possible. His approach was more about how we treat people who have made the transitions with all the potential complications that brings.